War has broken out in MAGA land between anti-immigrant diehards on one side and unelected policy influencers like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy on the other. Musk and Ramaswamy want the U.S. to continue giving visas to skilled immigrants who have been a crucial part of the Silicon Valley workforce. The other far-right MAGA folks say that those jobs should go to Americans, not foreigners, and especially not brown foreigners. I always say on the air, I'm not interested in palace intrigue and MAGA food fights and personality tiffs on Twitter/X don't move me. But one argument really did jump out to me for its hypocrisy, and it came from Ramaswamy. In a long post, he says, quote, "The reason top tech companies often hire foreign-born and first-generation engineers over Native Americans comes down to culture. A culture that venerates Corey from Boy Meets World, or Zack and Slater over Screech and Saved by the Bell, or Stefan over Steve Urkel in Family Matters will not produce the best engineers. More movies like Whiplash, fewer reruns of Friends, more math tutoring, fewer sleepovers, more weekend science competitions, fewer Saturday morning cartoons, more books, less TV, more creating, less chilling, more extracurriculars, less hanging out at the mall." Let's ignore for a minute that this sounds like the rant of an angry incel on Rumble, who despite his success today is still mad about getting rejected for the prom by a cheerleader in high school. It's also completely wrong and somewhat racist and a very myopic view of American culture. Foreign-born first-generation engineers are popular with tech companies because they are cheaper than American employees and have fewer employment rights. That's not a culture issue. That's an economics issue. Next, as someone who's been both Steve Urkel and Stefan Urkel in his life, let me update Vivek on nerdy cultural icons that everyone actually likes, like Lisa Simpson, or Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, Hermione Granger from Harry Potter, the whole cast of 6 seasons of Silicon Valley. Pharrell Williams was dropping rap and hip-hop albums for 4 years as Nerd. Not to mention Tony Stark, Peter Parker, and Black Panther's brilliant sister and top scientist in Wakanda, Shuri. Maybe the issue isn't that Americans don't like nerds, Vivek. Maybe people just didn't like you. And what greater validation could there be of how our culture supports education than the announcement by Yahoo Sports just yesterday that singer-songwriter Shaboozey will be performing at the Scripps National Spelling Bee? Take that, jocks. Joining us now to discuss, Tim Miller is a former spokesperson for the RNC. He is writer-at-large for The Bulwark. And Wajahat Ali is co-host of the podcast Democracy-ish and editor of The Left Hook on Substack. Wajahat, I'll start with you. I just want to read an excerpt of your column sort of about this internal battle. One of the most pathetic creatures in the MAGA universe is the person of color who truly believes that all of their prostrations to Trump, shameless parroting of right-wing propaganda, indulgence in racist conspiracies, and delusional adherence to the model minority stereotypes will finally earn the love and admiration of the base, which is forged from grievance, rage, and adherence to white supremacy. Bars. Wajahat, give me your general take of what we've seen over the last couple of days.
I tried to be very subtle. Face-eating leopards enjoys eating faces, especially those that are brown, because they're extra exotic and flavorful. This was inevitable. You know, this MAGA civil war between, immigrant MAGA versus nativist MAGA. And Vivek Ramaswamy is indeed a pathetic creature, a dweeb, like you mentioned, who, despite a life of privilege, becoming a billionaire, becoming, wealthy, still cannot get over the fact that he was rejected and holds the MAGA base, much like Musk, with contempt, right? This is what's so clear here, is that the 1% represented by Ramaswamy, Musk, despite everything they've been given in life, are still miserable, look down upon American culture, American workers, as contemptible fools. That's a quote from Elon Musk. Elon Musk retweeted a post where someone was saying, basically, this is a fight between the tech bros and MAGA, and the tech bros think that American workers are the R word, and Musk agreed with it. So I want MAGA voters to really look at this for a second. The people that they put in charge, the billionaires, look at them with contempt, look at the culture with contempt. And furthermore, people like Vivek Ramaswamy, Nikki Haley, Harmeet Dillon, look what they make you give, to quote Bourne Identity, another nerd movie, right? A nerdy brawler, Matt Damon. Look at what they make you give. They make you hate yourselves. They make you prostrate to Musk, to Trump, to racist conspiracies. You not only don't love yourself, they don't love you. And I want to end my rant with the following. According to a book written by Peter Baker and Susan Glasser on Trump, Trump looked at Nikki Haley when he was thinking about having her as Secretary of State and said, she has the wrong complexion. It won't be good for me. And I want Vivek to remember that Ann Coulter openly told him, I'll never vote for you because you're Indian. So this is what we're dealing with, a MAGA culture rooted in white supremacy that will always reject a Vivek and a Nikki who thought they were the model minorities, who worked really hard, and who dump on black people, poor people, immigrants of color, and refugees. And look what that's got them. It's got them this, a civil war with Laura Loomer, Cernovich, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Stephen Miller. I hope they eat each other. I'll have the popcorn with some paprika and butter on it.
Tim, you were actually involved in that tweet sort of with the R word. And I think it's telling, not just because of the sort of disingenuous nature of a lot of these arguments, but as Wash was just saying, the sort of disdain with which these unelected individuals who have policy influence have for the actual voters. Talk a little bit about how that can be a problem going forward, because, you know, what Vivek Ramaswamy wants to say and Elon Musk wants to say ends up having consequences for people who actually have to go out and get votes in the Republican Party. Isn't that a bit of a problem?
Yeah. It is. And just to be clear, I was involved in that tweet with the R word in the sense that I was making fun of it during a lengthy chain that people don't need to understand all the players in, because you got to be deep online, MAGA lore, to understand who's on what side of this fight. And it really was unfortunate, I think, that Corey from Boy Meets World caught strays in this whole disagreement. But look, it is funny that we've gotten to this place. To your question of whether it hurts them with voters, well, I mean, we just had an election, so it won't be for a while. But it does show that there was like an overthrow of the old Republican Guard, which I was once a part of many years ago now, almost a decade ago now. The Chamber of Commerce Republican Guard, the one that wanted compassionate conservatism, the one that wanted was pro-immigration. You go back and watch Reagan and Bush debates, and they're talking about how great immigration is. Reagan's final speech as president was about how important immigration is to the country. The Republican voters didn't want that, and they overthrew those leaders, the McCains and the Romneys, and the Kochs and the billionaire class, and they thought that they had found some new billionaires that were aligned with them in the culture war, because Elon Musk and all these other guys, these other tech bros, will go along with them on a lot of the culture war fights that don't affect them. They'll go after trans people, they'll go after the Hunter Biden laptop, they'll go after Fauci, those sorts of things, but on this immigration issue, this is something that affects their bottom line. It affects their companies. It affects them personally. Many of them are immigrants. And so now, all of a sudden, the voters are realizing, these MAGA voters, that they've just traded one set of rich guys that did not agree with their preferred policies when it comes to immigration for another set. And I think that is at the crux of this. And I do think that if Trump sticks with the Silicon Valley crowd, which it seems like he very well might, because he likes the attention, he likes the fact that they're famous, I do think it will create problems within the voting base, because this is their core issue. It is the immigration issue. You might call it nativism. The support for American workers over foreign workers. This is if MAGA is about anything, it's about that. And so I think that this is not just a Christmas week kerfuffle. This is going to be a long-term dispute within the coalition.
One of the other things in this, and you sort of make reference to it, Tim's made reference to it as well, is also sort of a cultural blindness that the Republicans seem to have, despite winning a close election and everything else like that. I was caught by the irony of Vivek Ramaswamy basically bringing up this sort of model minority myth, right? And complaining that, there's too much, kids spend too much time watching TV and parents should have them doing work. But he makes that point with nothing but cultural references from 30 years ago. If they actually want to have an influence in the culture, isn't it also important that the people who are at the head of these culture battles know something about what Americans are doing now? Or are they sort of proud of the fact that he's lost with where the heartbeat of America really is today?
Well, that's exactly it. They're so out of touch. They're out of touch with the majority of Americans who are working two jobs just to stay broke, right, to afford healthcare. And here are billionaires, the one percenters, coming in, lecturing down and mocking American culture. They called us lazy, right? They say apparently we don't like sports, we're watching too much television, and the hypocrisy of it all, right? They want to cut government spending, but they have received government subsidies. How did Elon Musk make his money? Through government subsidies. How did Vivek Ramaswamy make his money? Because his parents were lucky enough to come, thanks to the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, and they made their money, and he was born with not just boots, but bootstraps and a nice jacket as well. And so it shows you how out of touch they are with the American people who are working hard, but also the pop culture references. I want to name one. He said more Whiplash. That was a great movie released several years ago in which the drummer became so psychotic as a result of his deranged obsession with becoming the best drummer that by the end, yes, he wins the competition, but he loses his family, loses his girlfriend, and Damien Chazelle later said if that character had lived, he'd most likely kill himself. That's the model that Vivek Ramaswamy is saying, hey, be like that. Work harder, you peasants, you peons, you servants. Why don't you work hard and then you could be like me, a privileged billionaire who, by the way, made his money by pumping up this failed Alzheimer drug. Nice job of trying to win over the average American worker. I'm sure it'll land really well, especially during the holidays, Jason.
Today, U.S. officials have new intelligence linking Russia to a deadly Azerbaijan Airlines crash earlier this week. 38 people were killed on Wednesday when a commercial plane traveling to Russia crashed on the shores of the Caspian Sea. Now, two U.S. military officials tell NBC News that the Russian military may have misidentified the commercial plane as a Ukrainian drone, a mistake that would have triggered air defense systems and shot the plane down. So far, Russian officials have denied those claims and suggested that Ukraine is to blame. This all comes as the Kremlin has rejected President-elect Trump's calls for an immediate ceasefire to end the war in Ukraine. And fears of a wider war have begun to resurface in the Middle East as Israel steps up attacks against the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen. All of this potential chaos awaits Donald Trump when he enters the White House next month, but he appears to want even more chaos in the form of territorial expansion. This week, Trump escalated his threats to retake control of the Panama Canal, and he doubled down on his desire to take ownership of Greenland, as in Greenland. Joining me now is David Rothkopf, foreign policy expert who worked in the Clinton administration and now hosts the Deep State Radio podcast. David, it's great to have you on the program. Thank you for joining me in the middle of this holiday season. First of all, you know, Donald Trump has made a lot of seemingly unhinged promises. We'll see what comes of them. But the idea that he can end the war in Ukraine in his first 24 hours in office. First of all, what do you make of that? And what do you make of it, especially in the light of this potential air attack on the Azerbaijan commercial aircraft?
Well, I think Trump is already getting a cold dose of reality. That there was never a possibility that he was going to end it in 24 hours. What he was doing when he said he was going to end it was playing right into Putin's hands, because now Putin knows that the longer he drags this out, the worse the position is that Trump is in, and that the only leverage Trump has, he has no leverage over Putin, is over the Ukrainians. So Trump could pull support for the Ukrainians. But of course, Europe can support the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians can pursue this on their own. And I think what we're going to end up with is a long, complicated negotiation in which Putin plays a really tough line and says he wants not only all the territory, but he doesn't want Ukraine and NATO. He doesn't want Ukraine and Europe or part of the EU. And so I think this is going to go on for months and months. And it's just going to be another one of those promises like getting Mexico to build the wall that never materializes.
What do you think the potential appointment of Tulsi Gabbard, who is, if not a Russian asset, someone who has inclinations towards Putin, what do you think her at the office as the director of national intelligence, how that might affect the U.S.-Russia relationship under Trump?
Well, I mean, it would be a disaster if she were confirmed for this job. The intelligence community is extremely disturbed by the prospect of somebody who's so close both to Putin and also to Assad. But just take the story that you mentioned. The Russians are already putting out a fabricated conspiracy theory stories saying that the shoot down of the plane had to do with the Ukrainians. Typically, Americans debunk such stories. But Tulsi Gabbard in the past has embraced and promoted such stories. And so the idea that you have a Kremlin mouthpiece coming into the top intelligence job in the United States is bad for the U.S. And it's bad for Trump. It's bad to have that kind of person as an advisor because they're promoting lies. They're not promoting the truth.
I mean, there's so many things that Trump says and does that are confounding, right? But to use the week of Christmas and the Christmas holiday to launch sort of his plans for territorial expansion, retaking the Panama Canal, going after Greenland, and making Canada the 51st state, does one of these rise in your mind to the wackiest idea? Because they all seem pretty insane. But secondly, what do you think is behind the new American imperialism this week in particular?
I don't know. I think it was something he maybe ate over Christmas. This is kooky. Taking over Canada, going to war with Canada. That's from a South Park cartoon, right? This is South Park level foreign policy. You know how long Denmark has controlled Greenland? Since the year 1380. Okay, they've controlled Greenland for 700 years. The United States, even when we built the Panama Canal, said we were going to promote Panamanian independence, and our claims to the canal over the course of the century that we were there were very weak indeed, and that's why ultimately we signed it away. This is not going to materialize into anything except alienating our allies and making the President of the United States look like a buffoon.
Yeah, I mean, it must have been some Christmas ham, I guess, if that's what it led him to, right? I mean, and part of me wants to try it myself. What would happen? David Rothkopf, thank you for taking time away from roasting chestnuts over an open fire to join me tonight. Really appreciate the wisdom and thoughts.
My pleasure.
I want to bring in NBC's Aaron Gilchrist in Washington. Good to see you, Aaron. How are Donald Trump's plans for the start of his presidency taking shape behind closed doors? What do we know?
Well, Chris, I mean, you touched on some of the policy areas where we know the president-elect wants to put some focus pretty quickly. He has said publicly that we should expect him to start rolling out new policies and new executive orders within a couple of hours of being sworn in on the 20th. Immigration, we know, has gotten a lot of focus, right? Mr. Trump did face some backlash over his separation policy in his first term, but cracking down on immigration was a key part of his campaign that helped him get elected this time around. It was a top issue among people who voted for him, we know, according to an NBC News exit poll. And his new border czar, Tom Homan, told us just yesterday that Trump's Homeland Security team is huddling this week at Mar-a-Lago. They're putting finishing touches on plans for some of these executive orders to make good on his campaign promise to close the southern border, for example, to carry out what he called the largest deportation operation in American history. We know that could include family detention centers. It could lead to some families being separated again, as we saw during the first term. Homan did say that the ultimate plans are going to cost money. That's something to be considered, that these plans will be data-driven, he said. The president-elect is also expected to tackle some other issues very early on, if not on day one. He's talked about ending the war in Ukraine. He's talked about pardoning January 6th convicts. He talked about kicking transgender people out of the military, tariffs, climate policy, all of these things. It is an extensive list. And, Chris, I think between now and January 20th, we'll start to get a sharper picture of what the president-elect's biggest priorities are, just how easy or difficult it may be to take on some of these major actions that he's put on the table right out of the gate.
Aaron Gilchrist, thank you for that. Joining me now, former Florida Republican Congressman David Jolly, who is also an MSNBC political analyst. April Ryan is White House correspondent and Washington bureau chief for The Grio. Tia Mitchell is Washington bureau chief for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Great to have all of you here. Okay, April, I think it's been a bit since you and I talked, but we saw each other not so long ago. We were talking a little bit about this then. But now, dozens of times, we just put it in a graphic, Donald Trump has promised to deal with this or that on day one. So what does your reporting tell you about where exactly he's prioritizing? Where is his focus?
his focus, one, is all over the place. Just remember when he was president the first time, he overturned a lot of executive orders from then President Barack Obama. He's going to do the same in this moment with this time Joe Biden. But 2 or 3 issues really stand out to me. Closing the border, okay, making sure the southern border is closed, and then also starting to cut inflation. That's a contradiction, because once you cut the southern border, there's a balance in the economy, as I've said before, and many economists have said, there's a balance in the economy to have migrant workers here in this country. So how do you stave off inflation by shutting out migrant workers? That's something I would like to see worked out. And then the next piece, revoking DEI. Now, any education system in this country or anything that has federal funds that is promoting and endorsing DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the president plans to revoke federal dollars. What is that saying? It goes back to something I thought about with Carter G. Woodson in his book, The Miseducation of the Negro. Black people in this country have never really truly been educated properly. And now President-elect Donald Trump is going to make it worse.
So, Congressman, Axios described all of this, and I think, April just summarized some of it really well. They call it a really shock and awe campaign to lay the foundation for his ambitious second term. You see day one, do you think, as more about changing policy, a PR event to generate headlines? Will it be both? What are you looking for on January 20th?
Yeah, I think it will be. Understand, to effectuate policy change, there are kind of 3 mechanisms. The traditional how a bill becomes a law. That can't happen on day one. Regulatory rulemaking, where an administration exclusively issues and proclamates rules, that can't happen on day one. So what can happen by executive order or executive action? And you do see every president who has come in recent times with a list of executive actions, in part to kind of set the theme of their administration, but also effectuate real change. So from Aaron's reporting to April's comments, what could he do by executive action? He could revisit the stay in Mexico policy and do some things around the border. He could certainly shut down DEI. He will probably cancel some of the union requirements when it comes to federal contracts. There will be some areas where he can really lean in. He could do tariffs on day one as well. You can do that by executive proclamation. So I think they are lined up. They have a lot of these drafted. He will do it to make a statement about the new direction of the country. But what I'm really looking for, Chris, is does he either in his inaugural speech or on day one through some type of executive direction revisit what he has promised, which is to prosecute his enemies? That all this chatter around Liz Cheney, for instance, does he make the bold proclamation that his Department of Justice is going to go after political enemies? He's promised to do so. It would break some constitutional norms and arguably be fully unconstitutional. But we saw American carnage on day one of his first administration. What do we see on this one? It may be political prosecutions.
So, Tia, you operate in a state that Donald Trump flipped, right? And so you're a good person to talk about the folks out there who made a very conscious decision that he was going to make life better for them economically and otherwise. The conventional wisdom, I think, has been that Trump kind of now in his second term will understand more about how Washington works and he'll be more aggressive from the get-go. Is that what folks who voted for him are looking for? Do you think that he does understand better now than he did in his first term how to get things done?
So there are 2 ways of thinking about this. On one hand, people think that Donald Trump does have the 4 years of experience. He's got good advisors by his side, like Susie Wiles, who can kind of keep him focused and on track. But on the other way of thinking it is that a lot of the checks and balances that existed during his first term don't exist as strongly anymore. The Supreme Court is more conservative. Congress is more MAGA, more Republican. Fewer members of Congress will be willing to stand up to Donald Trump. So the question is, how does he decide to forge ahead? What does he prioritize? I will tell you, the voters in Georgia, the voters generally nationwide, went with Trump mainly on his economic message, which was tied somewhat to his message about the culture wars and immigration, but it still all came back to the economy. They expect him to bring down the price of goods, to make gas more affordable, purchasing homes and cars more affordable. That's what they're looking at, the prices at the grocery store. And if there isn't quick change there, I think a lot of people will feel like they were disappointed after putting their trust in Donald Trump for another term.
We don't want to put too much into the stock market, but I don't know if we have the numbers and we can put them up. But I'm told that the Dow right now is down about 500 points. Is that what you said? About 500, yeah. So there it is. There's the Dow down 510. So, April, there's a story today about how Donald Trump is preparing to wade into the fight, for example, over work from home. He wants all federal workers back in the office. There is no doubt that is going to create big pushback right away, including a union fight. Remind us, does public support matter to Trump? If a policy is unpopular, he doesn't have to run for re-election, right? So if a policy is unpopular, could that change his thinking?
The court of public opinion definitely matters to this president. I think about what happened with Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz said he didn't want to be a distraction to the president. And guess what? The president accepted his pullback from the nomination from the Department of Justice. Also, I remember there was public outrage during a gun shooting when President-elect Donald Trump was president. And he had this big White House East Room forum. And then he was talking about, I want to do this. He sounded more like he was pro-gun and gun legislation than he was pro-NRA. And then I guess after that, the NRA talked to him because he was listening to the chorus of America, seeing kids get shot. And then he listened to the NRA and he changed his tune. This president listens to media. He could be watching right now, Chris, on MSNBC. He listens and then he responds on Twitter. So the court of public opinion is very important to him as a man who reveres his brand. Remember that. His brand is everything. And if it tarnishes a little bit about people who are disinterested in what he does, if it's a large number of people, he might change his opinion.
Joining me now, former Pennsylvania Republican Congressman Charlie Dent and former Special Assistant to President Biden, Meghan Hayes. Good to have both of you here. All right, Congressman, start there. What will this speakership election tell us in terms of how the 119th Congress is going to go?
Well, as you know, Speaker Johnson is starting off with a very slim majority. On swearing-in day, there will be 219 Republicans to 215 Democrats. And already one Republican, Tom Massie of Kentucky, has said that he will not be voting for Johnson. I don't believe that Johnson can lose any more than that. So if Republicans melt down and they can't rally around Johnson for Speaker, we could see a fair amount of chaos because there doesn't seem to be somebody else waiting in the wings who does have the necessary votes to become Speaker. So right now what will happen is if Donald Trump decides to weigh in and support Johnson, that will certainly give his candidacy a boost. But given what happened just before Christmas, when Elon Musk and Donald Trump more or less kneecapped Johnson on the continuing resolution after he had negotiated a bipartisan deal, they actually helped weaken him. And you're now hearing the leaders of the Freedom Caucus saying they're uncommitted in terms of who they're going to support. So this could be kind of messy, especially leading up to January 6th. They'll have to certify the presidential results.
I want to play, Meghan, part of what Republican lawmaker Claudia Tenney said about the situation that Republicans find themselves in right now.
This is going to be a very slim majority, and we do not want to go through the speaker battle that we went through with Kevin McCarthy after he was ousted for over 3 weeks and several different candidates. And we ended up with Mike Johnson. If we carry on January 3rd and go on into past January 6th, we will lose the ability to certify President Trump on January 6th, which is critically important to advancing the America First agenda.
I just want to remind folks that it took 22 days to find a new speaker last time. So, I mean, gosh, if it would take the same amount of time, it would even push it past Inauguration Day. But what do you see happening here? How do you think this is going to unfold?
I think eventually they'll coalesce behind Johnson. I don't think there's another viable option here, but I do think that the Republicans are learning how hard it is to govern. You can't govern through sending out tweets or X's or whatever they're called now. And Elon Musk is not an elected member of anything, the White House or Congress. And so I just think that folks are learning how hard it is to actually govern and how much they are going to need to compromise. Johnson is their best option right now. They don't have someone else that could even take the mantle, let alone if Trump would support him or not. So I do think that if they want to certify the election on January 6th, they are going to figure out how to get behind Johnson.
Yeah, so Congressman, it doesn't get any easier once they do have a speaker in place, obviously. The Wall Street Journal points out what we've been talking about. The tight math means for the early months of Trump's presidency, Republicans may not be able to afford more than one no vote, a daunting task for party leaders in a conference that often features intra-party brawls and is trying to pass an ambitious tax and immigration agenda. So practically speaking, what's a speaker, whether it's Johnson or someone else, to do?
Well, I think the next Republican speaker is going to have Hakeem Jeffries on speed dial because they're probably going to need him. As we've seen many times, Republicans have had a dysfunctional majority in the House for the past few years. Now, with Donald Trump as president, that dysfunction may be a little bit less because Trump can lean on them. But just remember, there are 30-some votes in the House, and we saw this just a couple of weeks ago with the continuing resolution discussion. There are 30-some Republicans who are never going to vote for continuing resolutions to fund the government or appropriations bills or debt ceilings. So they're going to need Democrats to help them in the House on any number of issues. So they have to get ready for that and just accept it. But that's always been the challenge in the House Republican Conference. The hardliners don't like to do compromise, particularly in divided government. But now that we have one-party government, Republicans controlling the House, Senate, and presidency, that might help them a bit. But again, there's always going to be a few people who aren't going to be able to support the agenda. And it might not just be hardliners this time. It could be people more from the center, who do not want to maybe support something too hardline because they have to worry about general elections. So the fractures could come in a lot of different directions going forward.
So, Megyn, what is the role of House Democrats come 2025, and do they hold a lot of power?
Yeah, I think they hold an incredible amount of power. I think that they hold the ability to get anything done. So if they're willing to compromise on things that are good legislation for the working class families and the American people, I think you'll see the Democrats voting with the Republicans. But I don't think that the continuing resolution and the way that the Republicans negotiated that and then reneged on their negotiations is a good start for the next Congress. I think that leaves Hakeem Jeffries in a spot of a little bit of anxious to do negotiating because it just, they weren't good faith actors. So I do think that we could have a stalemate until the midterm elections when the Democrats could win overwhelmingly.
We're joined now by former Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo and Brendan Buck, former staffer to House Speakers John Boehner and Paul Ryan. Carlos, I want to start with you. Family separations were politically unpopular, not just with Democrats, but with Republicans. Not to mention, they're now legally banned. So why suggest a move that could lead to more families being split up? And how would they even put this into practice, given that it's been banned by a court judge?
Well, that's right. Immigration is an issue where Donald Trump and Republicans are on offense, right? We know that it was the weakest issue for Joe Biden during his presidency. It was a very weak issue for Vice President Harris during her campaign. And it was really the issue, just like in 2016, that Donald Trump emphasized the most. And got elected doing so. So Republicans definitely have public support for addressing the immigration issue in a meaningful way, but there is certainly risk there if they get too aggressive, if they come across as cruel to innocent people, to people who are in this country not committing crimes or not cheating, but just trying to live in peace, then that there could be a backlash. And like you said, not just among Democrats, but also among Republicans in Congress who are probably going to face some headwinds in the 2026 midterm election. So there is a careful balancing act here, even though Republicans do have the wind at their backs when it comes to the immigration issue.
Yeah, Brendan, I want to ask you about that exact thing. There was this swell of public opposition to the zero tolerance policy the first time around. Could Trump be undercutting his own support if they, pursue these cruel policies?
Yeah, the how is really important, not just the what here. I mean, immigration enforcement as a concept, very popular. And there's a lot of things that Donald Trump could be doing in a few weeks here, a few months, that I think would be really beneficial to him. If he's able to stem the tide of people coming across the border and put in really strong border enforcement, I think that will be really popular. When it comes to the interior enforcement, though, as Carlos said, significant risk. And I think Donald Trump appreciates that. When he gets asked about this in any more specificity, he always pivots to, well, we're just going to start by going after the criminals and the dangerous people who are here. Now, that's much easier said than done. If people knew that there were dangerous criminals here, we would be deporting them already. So I think he understands after the experience of his first term that there are ways that you can do this that become really unpopular. If we know anything about Donald Trump, he wants to be popular. I think Tom Homan here is a political liability for him. Tom Homan clearly has so much zeal for this issue and so much disregard for the views of other people on this, that if he sort of let loose to run wild on this, he could do some things that I think would be very damaging to Donald Trump politically, not to mention the real world effects of these people who are in this country. So I think this is something Donald Trump and his team need to keep a close eye on, not just letting Tom Homan do whatever he wishes.
Yeah, for a Republican coalition that seemed really on the same page when folks went to the polls in November, we're already seeing these divisions within the party. And Carlos, right now there's this feud brewing over H-1B visas. I mean, if you've spent any time on Twitter or X, whatever we're calling it now, it's getting really ugly. On one side, you've got folks like Elon Musk and tech executives who are favoring loosening restrictions on visas for skilled workers. And then on the other side, you've got Laura Loomer and, mega nationalists on their feeds tweeting away and slamming the idea. Is this an early test of which faction is going to dominate in this administration?
Well, for sure. And I think this is also going to play out in the House of Representatives, as Brendan knows and remembers well. The Republican Party has the 5 families in the House, right, which is the way they describe the different groups that make up the House Republican Conference. And there are people who will likely find some common ground with Ms. Loomer here and start attacking Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, and some of President Trump's biggest supporters. So this is definitely going to be a complicated process. The irony is that immigration is probably the issue where Republicans are most united. I think tax policy will end up being a lot more difficult. But even though they have momentum, even though the country wants to see greater immigration enforcement, border security, there are these divisions among Republicans, and some of these positions are really kind of out there. I mean, these visas are important to the country. They're important to our economy. Employers need people to do these jobs. So this is a good example of how complicated life can be, particularly in the U.S. House next year. That he assumes the gavel again, which I believe he will.
Brendan, I'm wondering, when you look at this Republican coalition and these competing ideologies that are kind of emerging within it, do you think it's durable? I mean, we're even seeing factions within the supposed cabinet. Can they hold this all together? Will this all get worked out in the wash as they start to govern, or is it a real risk factor?
I mean, it's going to be messy for sure. And I think what ends up happening is you just don't focus on these areas where we've got disagreement. We've got agreement on border security. We've got some level of agreement on what enforcement looks like. But this issue, which sort of comes down to, do you want to allow sort of the best and brightest from around the world to come to America and use their skills here and benefit our economy? Or do you hold a view that just steals a job from an American and there should be no immigration? And that is what a lot of the nationalists are saying. That is, I would say, a minority view, but it's been one that has been in Republican politics for a long time and has prevented us from doing anything on immigration, because you can never get everybody on the same page when it's a question of not just, how do you handle people who are already here, but what kind of legal immigration system do you want to have and what kind of things do you want to reward? I imagine they'll just punt on this issue, say we're not going to focus on this and find areas of common ground, because they're going to have plenty of various things that they have to do, like funding the government, like tax reform, like a debt limit, that's going to have them divided in the first place. And there's only so many fights you can take on as a leadership. They'll hold it together to the extent that we have held it together for the last 10 years or so, but there are some very deep divisions within our party. And certainly the Trump era has elevated some of those more nationalist voices that were much more a minority voice, and I think they have much more sway than they ever have before.
The extreme weather across the country that's threatening to disrupt what's expected to be one of the busiest travel weekends of the year. NBC News correspondent Sam Brock will bring us the details.
A terrifying funnel cloud churned through the fields northwest of Dayton, Texas, one of at least 8 reported in the region, including in Louisiana, the day after Christmas.
It's on the water right now.
This twister reportedly captured at Lake Houston in Crosby, Texas, about 30 miles northeast of Houston. And in El Campo, the powerful shear of this one leaving witnesses awestruck. The Lone Star State also getting pummeled by an intense hail shower, making it hard to just walk outside. Just days after the first white Christmas in 15 years in New York City, all eyes are on the forecast for the big New Year's celebration in Times Square, with expected rainfall threatening to put a damper on the party. Meanwhile, for the holiday travelers still returning home, millions facing severe weather and dangerous driving conditions all across the country. Floodwaters continuing to cause concerns in Dallas and Fort Worth. And much farther west in Northern California, an area that's already seen record-breaking rainfall, they're expecting another round of heavy snow and rain this weekend. Snowfall totals for the Cascades and Sierra Nevada can range anywhere from 5 to 18 inches, and over the Rockies, up to 3 feet. All of that just the stormy crescendo for a week that's seen California lose a pier in popular Santa Cruz on Monday. And speaking of the Sierra, drivers forced to take it slow while the area struggles to dig out from more than a half-foot of fresh powder that snarled holiday traffic.
That was NBC's Sam Brock with that report, and certainly good luck to all those traveling this weekend.